Reform leader Nigel Farage is just committed to maintaining the triple lock on pensions if Reform UK win the next election. And on the surface, that sounds entirely reasonable because people who've worked their whole lives should be able to retire with dignity, right? It shouldn't be controversial, but let's have a look at what he said.
For me, what decided it was, number one, there are a lot of older pensioners who got their pensions before 2016 who are really pretty disadvantaged by the current system. Secondly, that the people to whom pensions are being paid, in vast majority, certainly compared to a younger generation today, are those that have actually worked and paid into the system, and we are very much the party of Alarm Clock Britain, those that work, and therefore should reap rewards later in life. But the third and most decisive reason is that within the next 2 weeks, we are going to announce the biggest cuts to the benefits bill ever seen in the history of this country. So when questions get asked in a minute, how can you afford it? Well, we can afford it many, many times over, given what we're going to announce within the next fortnight.
Take like a shot every single time someone wants to come for those who are on universal credit or on benefits. It's getting really boring at this point. But let's just stick to the pensioners for now. On the surface, it sounds pretty fair. People will lap it up because it sounds like he's defending people who have contributed to society and deserve security in old age. And to be clear, people absolutely should be able to retire with dignity after working, for as long as they have. But this is Farage we're talking about. So let's sift through the BS a little bit, guys, because the way he's framing that argument really matters because it's doing something much more political beneath the surface. Because yes, people contributed, but no, they did not build up their own individual pot with their name on it. The UK state pension is not a private savings account. It's basically like a pay-as-you-go system where today's workers fund today's pensioners and future workers will fund those retiring in years to come. It's a collective system built on an ongoing social contract between generations. So when politicians use language about people having paid into the system, as if they have a personal entitlement stored up for themselves, what they're really doing is moralising entitlement and setting up the idea that some groups are more worthy of support than others. And once you introduce that sort of logic, it doesn't stop at pensions, does it? And we know that because we already see exactly how that framing is being extended. Look at Generic confirming what it is I'm about to unpack in a second.
In my experience, younger people want their parents and their grandparents to have a decent retirement. And it seems to me there's quite a lot of people who have pretty comfortable lives who seem to want to take away a decent state pension from people who are finding life actually very difficult at the moment. It's not easy to live on £230 a week, particularly when everyone's bills are going through the roof at the moment. And we should be looking after those people. And that is a sentiment that, in fact, all the evidence suggests people of all generations share, particularly people who understand what it's like living in tough circumstances like that. But if you're asking me how can we help young people to have better lives, well, reform is very clear. We want to get good jobs back into the country. We want to get some economic growth going again. And you do that with a different energy policy to the one that's happened in recent years, which has deindustrialized the country and is making us uncompetitive. We want to ensure that we can get building again so that there are more homes for young people, something that is clearly failing at the moment, where the government is miles off its target, and all governments of recent times have failed to deliver enough. And we want to put the interests of British young people first. I think a British young person, like everyone in this country, would be astonished to see the tens of billions of pounds that are being spent on illegal migration, on benefits for people who aren't even British citizens. Our approach is going to make the public finances more sustainable, get good jobs going for young people. But I think most young people in this country would agree with us that the first port of call for savings is not the elderly, is not their parents and their grandparents.
It feels like he's when someone's trying to fill in like a word count in an essay, he just said so much but didn't say anything at all. And it's not new when it comes from the likes of Generic and stuff and just reformers as a whole. But then you've got people like Sophie who make it make you feel really grateful. They make you feel really great for having a few brain cells that don't always fight each other. She says young people, pensioners, getting a pension, they can live off after working their whole damn lives is not an attack on us. It is the hotel dwellers and those that can't be asked to work that we have to pay for that are the problem. That is the actual unfairness here. Arguing that pensions are not the problem and that the real unfairness comes from migrants in asylum hotels or people who supposedly cannot be bothered to work is so surface level and like is it encapsulates what Twitter's all about, to be honest. Reem Ibrahim responded with this and said the state pension is £146 billion. Asylum seeker hotels are £2.1 billion. I do think it's a rarish win from Ibrahim, but I still think she's reinforcing that narrative by comparing £146 billion spent on pensioners with £2.1 billion spent on asylum accommodation, because there are going to be people who are angry at both, as if those two figures exist on the same scale of political significance. But call me controversial, but I'm sick and tired of the pandering to old people. They have lived very, very different lives to young people, very different lives to a lot of us. So maybe we should get some violins out for the pensioners, shall we? Who, like I said, have lived a very different life to what we're living as young people today. While some of them are out there on their cruises around the Caribbean, we're scrambling trying to get ourselves on the housing ladder. And if I have to hear from another OAP that I need to just work harder, I am just going to lose it, because that's what they say every time. If you jump on Twitter, they are constantly saying, oh, well, if you work hard, you'll be able to get onto the property ladder. If you work hard, you'll be able to afford your fuel. Like, no, that's not how it works. Because if you genuinely believe that pressures facing young people today, the inability to afford housing, the stagnation of wages, the rising cost of living, deindustrialisation, by the way, since Thatcher, are being driven by £2.1 billion in asylum spending rather than by structural issues in the economy, then you're not analysing the system at all. You are a fool, a mug being directed away from it. And sorry, but young people want to actually afford rent. Like, is that some crazy thing to think about? People shouldn't have to have two fucking jobs to survive. I'm not trying to do whataboutisms, but I think we need a serious analysis, and we need to be asking questions like, why has housing become so unaffordable? We should be asking why rent consumes such a large proportion of our income. How many of us have to spend so much of our income every single month on rent? It would ask why wages have failed to keep pace with inflation for years, and it would ask why wealth has become increasingly concentrated at the top, whilst public services are being stretched in the way that they are. But instead of those questions being asked, we're given a much simpler story, a story where the problem is not the system, where you've got people like Sophie telling us, young people, that we need to just, get over it and really look after our old people who have paid into the system. It's getting boring. But this is not a new strategy. This is the continuation of political strategy that successive governments have relied on. For decades, we've seen governments that have allowed housing to become a vehicle for wealth accumulation rather than basic need, who have weakened labour protections, weakened unions, normalised insecure work. They've implemented austerity policies for years and years. And at every stage, rather than addressing those systemic issues, they've encouraged the public to focus on who is deserving and who is not. It's exactly why they keep talking about cutting things when it comes to benefits. And I'm sorry, the state pension basically does function like that. Do I want pensioners to have a safe life? Of course I do. Do I want them in warm homes? Of course I do. Who doesn't? But I also want young people to not have to fucking suffer the way that they do every single day. But again, I really need to preface, we have a very different economic reality in comparison to the oldies. One shaped by political decisions that have made stability a lot harder to achieve. We have lived very different lives. Mike, I could go on and on and on, but I actually want to get your thoughts on whether Farage is pandering to the oldies, to the pensioners. Do you think he's pandering? Does he actually care about the pensioners?
I mean, he has to pander, right? Because Farage's base is older, it's whiter, it's predominantly male. These tend to be people who are outside the major cities, living kind of post-industrial coastal towns. They're homeowners. The kind of coalition we saw kind of mobilized around Leave in 2016 is the same coalition that's being mobilized now. And I think when he speaks about triple lock, he isn't speaking about a kind of economic story here. It's partly an economic story, but I think it's also partly cultural. It's kind of binary he draws between the deserving and undeserving that Jemrick also drew on in his contribution. It's this idea that there are some people who are kind of like sponging off the state. There's illegal immigrants who are, coming to this country and receiving benefits, and we're paying for all of that stuff. And you guys, for deserving, aren't getting what you deserve from Britain, from kind of society. This is all about a cultural narrative that Farage wants to spread. This idea of the undeserving versus the deserving. It's a pretty dangerous binary, and I think Farage has to pander to his group. Right, this group is an important base for Farage. He's talking to his base, to his people, these older voters, who fundamentally really care about pensioners? Probably not. But Farage is a politician and knows these people are the people who like to vote for him. I think it's really important to think about Farage and think about what he's trying to achieve. I think, Farage is not offering anything to people under 40. So you speak about you hear Jemrick say, we care about young people, and he kind of opens it with this idea of like reform caring for young people. I want our viewers, our listeners, to tell me, what is the reform offering for young people? What is reform offering for young people who are under 40, right? We see housing is a real problem. We see kind of insecure employment's a problem. We see kind of childcare for young professionals a real problem. Education is a real. There are so many problems young people are facing up and down Britain, and are not at all reform not even attempting to address these issues being faced by young people. So reform's offering for me is quite shallow. It's this kind of cultural framing of the deserving versus the undeserving, and in Farage's eyes, the deserving are kind of like older white voters who are going to likely to vote for reform, and maybe younger people, marginalised groups are the less deserving. This is the binary he's chosen to draw. And for me, I think this is a real cultural story that Farage is trying to tell. And the dangerous thing I think Farage does is he frames all of this through the lens of common sense. Of course, because you paid into the system, you deserve more than what you're getting. Of course, we shouldn't be funding these illegal migrants. It's this kind of common sense framing. He kind of distills these really complex situations into just like kind of really simple narratives, like these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, it's these people's fault, we're going to do more for you guys. That kind of common sense framing is really, really dangerous, because what it does is that he shifts the kind of norms. Like you kind of present a new normative argument and present it in such simple terms. I think it's really, really dangerous, and I think it is really, really worrying that reform are choosing to kind of pander in this way. And again, I'm totally with you, Sarah. I think pensioners and older people deserve to live a real quality life. Like I want us to be a nation and to be a people who care for the elderly. I think you learn a lot about a nation by how they care for the elderly. So I don't think any of us are sat here today and saying, reform shouldn't, or no political party should have an offering for older people. Of course they should. The problem with reform's offering is it's clearly a political decision to pander to older voters. It's clearly a political decision to think about triple locking these terms, and this kind of binary draw between the deserving and the undeserving. All of this is entirely political, and it fits into the kind of broader narrative reform's been trying to create for years and years of illegal immigration being this huge problem, and these older voters, these kind of white, predominantly white older voters being let down by the state, being let down by the system. That's a really dangerous narrative to draw. And again, it's this kind of simple reform framing of common sense. It's all about the immigrants. We're going to help solve things. Actually, I don't think reform have a lot of answers to the problems we face as a nation. And that's going to be one of their problems, right? Because you need to govern for a nation. Reform couldn't just govern for people over 50, right? You need at some point some kind of meat on the bones and a story you're going to tell to younger people. And so far, all we have from reform when it comes to young people is a really vague platitude about we're going to build homes and we're going to like economic growth, all very vague, right? I think reform and Farage are essentially pandering to their base, and it's all about this kind of cultural narrative of the deserving and the undeserving.
Yeah, you make a really great point, actually, because the question is not whether we should like pander to old people, and it's not whether we should cut support elsewhere. The question is why in one of, I think we're the sixth richest country when it comes to nominal GDP, like why in a country that it has so much wealth, that we're being told that there's not enough to ensure basic security for everyone without taking from someone else. And I think that's something that frustrates me. I love that you'd spoken about the deserving and undeserving binary, because that was going to be my follow-up question. But I do have another question for you, because the rhetoric that is coming out a lot at the moment, and I think that young people are facing, is you do have the weaponization of generational politics, this whole like, but if you just work harder, then you'll be able to have an easier life. And I do hear it from boomers. I do hear it from the older generations, but like I had to graft to get to where I needed. Like you do hear them say that. So what would you say when people say, but it's always been tough? What are they doing to history? Are they flattening history? What's the risk in just reducing it simply to, but it's always been tough, so kind of get over it?
Yeah, I think that's just kind of classic. Just work hard. If you just work harder, you'll kind of overcome all of these problems. It's your fault. You're having too much avocado on toast. That kind of very simple, boring story. As someone who works with young people, obviously I lecture at university. I see how hard my students work. I see how dedicated they are to their studies, and how anxious they get about jobs, about education, all kinds of things. The problem we have in Britain is we are offering nothing to young people, right? Services, you can sometimes youth services have been cut. We're seeing schools crumble, and state schools across the country being completely underfunded and neglected. The teaching sector, which I'm sure you know all about, Sarah. Think about the conditions teachers are having to kind of work through. That again is of course going to affect the education being given to young people, and later on in life it's going to have huge repercussions. So there are so many ways in which Britain is not functioning for young people, and simply saying we need to work harder and things have always been tough ignores the huge structural problems that continue to grow in Britain. Young people leave university with huge debts. It's now becoming more and more difficult to find a job. It's now becoming more and more difficult to get on the housing ladder unless you have help from your parents. And of course, that's not easy for all young people. Not every young person can turn to the bank of mum and dad and get some help with a deposit for a house. So what you're now seeing is just seeing adulthood extended into kind of adolescence rather, extended into your kind of mid-30s, where people are still living at home in their early to mid-30s because they can't afford to buy a property. Now that simply is not okay, and telling people just to work harder is not going to solve those problems. I think we need some kind of politicians who are able to diagnose the structural problems we face when it comes to inequality, when it comes to underinvestment, all these structural issues we face as a nation, diagnose those and actually try and think about something that we can do about them, not just blaming immigrants, not just blaming those on benefits, not these kind of really simple narratives that some politicians try and carve. These are actually really deep structural problems that won't be solved by just working harder. So I find that narrative quite condescending. And again, I see young people on a daily basis working hard at university, committed to their studies, that guarantees them nothing. It guarantees them nothing because Britain around them is crumbling. I was speaking to one of my former students who's one of the hardest working students you ever would have met, got a first class honours, went to do a master's, got a distinction. She's struggling to find a job simply because there's just not that many jobs out there for young people. So these are not people who aren't working hard, who aren't committed, who don't love this country. These are people who do all the things you should do and have been let down by the state around them. And again, Reform haven't got a story, or certainly compelling or convincing story, to address any of the issues young people are facing beyond, hey, just work harder, buddy, and it'll be all okay for you.